Perhaps the material is just too damn bleak, maybe the runtime is too grueling for its own good, or some strange artistic choices just make it tough to want to go back there. Whatever the reason, I am Gareth, this is Whatculture, and here are 10 awesome recent movies you'll never watch again. Beau is Afraid. Whether you loved or hated Ari Aster's unhinged horror comedy Beau is Afraid, one thing's for sure, you will not forget it anytime soon. It's hardly surprising that Aster's bold artistic swing was a massive box office flop, because a 179-minute nightmarish Odyssey that literally feels like a 3-hour panic attack just isn't going to appeal to most people. And even accepting the brilliance of both Aster's uncompromising vision and Joaquin Phoenix's phenomenal performance, it's tough to persuade oneself to go through the whole thing again. One of the most common complaints about the film is that Beau's mid-film trek into the wilderness, where he stumbles across a traveling acting troupe, kills the story's pacing dead. It's by far the most polarizing part of an already wildly divisive movie, and so for many they'll simply watch Beau is Afraid a single solitary time, and then harbour a solid respect for it forevermore, while never once entertaining the possibility of sitting through it again.
The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. There is no sense denying the fact that The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas is effective in its twisty agenda to make you feel even the slightest sense of the enormity of the horrors of the Holocaust, but it's not something you'd ever want to revisit recreationally. Part of the problem of the story, which adapts John Boyne's same-title book about two 8-year-old boys on either side of an extermination camp's barbed wire, is that when you've heard it, it loses its impact. And it only loses its impact because it is so deeply, horrifyingly traumatic. You're led to feel some slight flicker of hope that young Shmuel will get out and he and Bruno can reclaim their normal lives. But then the actual ending drains every ounce of positivity of you as both boys end up dead. And not only is it sad, but it invites you to only feel some vague perverse triumph in the fact that Bruno's father, one of the camp's commander, pays for his almost flippant inhumanity with his own son's life. And feeling that is awful in itself.
Society of the Snow. Society of the Snow is a brilliantly constructed dramatization of a 1972 plane crash which left members of a Uruguayan rugby team stranded in the Andes, desperately fighting to survive. Though given a decidedly more Hollywood treatment with 1993's Alive, this new take cleaves away the gloss and focuses on a more immersive, factual retelling of the catastrophe. But for as meticulously detailed, visually jaw-dropping and superbly acted as it is, Society of the Snow is also a harrowing, gut-wrenching sit for most of its 144 minutes, pulling no punches with its depiction of the instigating crash and increasingly fraught survival scenario that follows. Even though the story is punctuated by some climactic hope, everything leading up to it is so tough to watch, especially the means the survivors resort to in order to stave off starvation, that you couldn't be blamed for vowing never to revisit it.
The Passion of the Christ. Whether you care to call it Mel Gibson's passion project in the name of his devout religious beliefs, or a vital narrative reflecting on human condition, or a vehicle for indoctrination, The Passion of the Christ is well made. It looks incredible at times, and Jim Caviezel's performance as Jesus Christ is stunning, particularly as he's rarely been as captivating, and it does tell a compelling story, but it's also engineered to make you feel something very particular. Guilt. There's something definitely distasteful in there, and it's way too perversely fetishistic of violence, but it never preaches to its credit. The issue though is that it is intentionally excruciating, and after a while, that just becomes too much of a slog, particularly when it's also trying to remind you that you did it, sort of.
The Whale. Darren Aronofsky typically isn't in the business of making fuzzy, feel-good movies, and so it wasn't exactly a surprise that his adaptation of Samuel D. Hunter's acclaimed play The Whale was one hell of a tough sit. Brendan Fraser won a well-earned Best Actor Oscar for his portrayal of a morbidly obese man who attempts to reconnect with his estranged daughter, and as transfixing as the work of Fraser and his co-stars is here, watching a dangerously overweight man continue down his self-destructive path for almost 2 hours makes The Whale a uniquely rough outing. Fraser's performance leaves enough of an impression that you likely won't feel the need to watch the film ever again, especially combined with the common criticism that it feels like a filmed play, per the movie's extremely limited use of locations and confined, some might say uncinematic nature. That's without getting into the controversy surrounding its polarizing depiction of its embattled central character, which might additionally dissuade you from ever going back to it.
Blue Valentine. From one excruciating film to another of an entirely different kind. Blue Valentine is an utterly spellbinding story of blossoming romance, all volatile and fresh and exciting, wrapped up in a story of catastrophic, heartbreaking destruction of the same relationship. It's a simultaneous bookend showing Ryan Gosling's Dean and Michelle Williams' Cindy growing apart as it explains how they came together. Thanks to the intense chemistry between Williams and Gosling and the succinct brilliance of their performances, you feel every spark of magic and every devastating blow. And by the end, as you watch Dean walk away broken, the emotional toll it takes on you is really not something you'd ever want to relive.
The Zone of Interest. Jonathan Glazer's stunning Best Picture nominee, The Zone of Interest, is a grueling, exhausting film, which unfolds in the shadow of the Auschwitz concentration camp as a Nazi commandant and his family live in their dream home mere feet away. Despite featuring not a single on-screen death, Glazer's film ingeniously uses both pin-sharp sound design and precise visual framing to imply the horrific events taking place just out of view, ensuring it's no less traumatic a sit than a more outwardly explicit dramatization of the Holocaust. It's a film that leaves a nauseated, horrified feeling when it's over, and even though it's a relatively svelte 105 minutes in length, the audience is locked into Glazer's vice grip for the entirety. The Zone of Interest leaves a bruising impact on even the most hardened of viewers, and so few will ever likely decide to go back to it, no matter how expertly assembled it undeniably is.
Manchester by the Sea. Like Blue Valentine, Manchester by the Sea is a deeply affecting, horribly traumatic movie without ever wading into provocative, emotionally lurid waters for the sake of impact. It merely feels like a deeply, deeply sad story about troubled characters in such a way that it gets into your bones and breaks them from the inside. It's essentially a story of how one wound that would be difficult enough to bear, the death of a family member at a young age and the effective orphaning of his son, tears open older wounds of the brother charged with being the guardian of his nephew. And despite this sort of setup usually leading to a revelation and a happy ending, Manchester by the Sea just piles on the misery until Casey Affleck's lead realizes he cannot have his epiphany. It's a sad, hollowing full stop, and by then you're so wrung out, repetition is not an option.
The Killer. David Fincher's The Killer is perhaps the filmmaker's most peculiar effort to date. A seemingly well-trod assassin botches a hit thriller, which is actually anything but. Fincher's latest film is positively awash in sarcasm from start to finish, depicting the travails of a hitman who claims to be the epitome of professionalism, and yet constantly proves himself to be quite the opposite. It's a resoundingly funny film, albeit one whose dark humor and subversion of the typical hitman movie are sly enough that general audiences likely found The Killer a bit too devious for its own good. Less entertaining than utterly fascinating. The Killer is directed with expectedly surgical precision by Fincher, but when you cross the familiar nuts and bolts of the setup, with an execution primed to turn off casual audiences looking for a basic assembly thriller, it's a little surprised that many conceded this to be one of the filmmaker's minor efforts. You'll likely glean everything you need to from a single viewing, and as great as Michael Fassbender is in it, the rewatch value simply isn't there compared to Fincher's bona fide classics like Seven, Fight Club, and The Social Network.
We need to talk about Kevin. Like many of the films explored here, Lynn Ramsey's adaptation of We Need to Talk About Kevin is most effective because of the strength of the performances holding it together. John C. Reilly is very good without anything showy, and Tilda Swinton is incredible. But it's the performances of Jasper Newell and even more so Ezra Miller as Kevin, their son who committed a high school massacre, that are most profound. Both kids are like daggers in your brain, awfully unhinged, sadistic, and almost satanic. And then, as we're told the story of what happened that day and we're shown the added tragedy of what Kevin did, murdering his father and younger sister as well as his schoolmates, it's almost too much to bear. Watching it again is almost like being complicit in the sadism.
Anatomy of a Fall. Unlike most movies on this list, the brilliant Anatomy of a Fall is neither too depressing nor too weird to merit a second viewing. It's simply that the experience is so expertly hinged around its central mystery that no repeat viewing can be quite the same. Now, of course, knowing the outcome of a mystery-laden story doesn't stop people from rewatching them, but given that Anatomy of a Fall never actually reveals whether Sandra killed her husband or not, that point isn't so much applicable. This 152-minute courtroom drama delves into such literally forensic detail of the focal incident that the viewer is likely to feel exhausted by the end, especially accepting the dramatic intensity authenticity of certain sequences, namely an unforgettable, brilliantly acted reconstruction of a volatile argument Sandra had with her husband. As such, the prospect of going back there isn't too appealing. No matter that Justine Trier's drama is absolutely one of 2023's best.
United 93. The story of the 9/11 terrorist atrocities was always going to inspire filmmaking, because art is most profoundly how we understand history, or at least how we re-engage with it to make it accessible and help us comprehend these tragedies. But those stories were so deeply traumatic and so close and personal that catching the right balance was also always likely to be a challenge. However, Paul Greengrass's haunting, heartbreaking elegy to the passengers on United Airlines Flight 93 manages the feat, and it's largely unprecedented. The film feels like a sort of waking funeral because the story has no hope, and there's no protective barrier between its start and its horrifying tragedy. You go in prepared and it wrings you out. While it's of course an important story to tell, it just feels so personal, and so it feels more like a haunting museum exhibit in the end.
The Iron Claw. The Iron Claw is one of the best films ever made about the world of professional wrestling. Second perhaps only to Darren Aronofsky's The Wrestler, and like that film, it paints an extremely bleak picture of the industry's historic tendency to destroy lives. Sean Durkin's biographical drama depicts the legendary Von Erich wrestling dynasty from the late 1970s through to the early 1990s, chronicling the family's bevy of premature deaths, which led to them being deemed cursed. Though richly mounted by Durkin and brilliantly acted by its ensemble cast, best of all, a never better Zac Efron, seriously the guy kills it in this film. This is an almost unbearably devastating drama in which death is always around the corner. In fact, the real story in which 5 of the 6 Von Erich sons died before the age of 35 is so upsetting that Durkin decided to erase the youngest of the brothers, Chris, from the story entirely, feeling that his death at age 21 was one more tragedy that the film couldn't really withstand. As wonderfully crafted as The Iron Claw is from top to bottom, it takes a lot out of the viewer, and so all but the most die-hard wrestling fans will likely decide that one viewing is enough.
The Revenant. There are lots of jokes about how Leonardo DiCaprio literally had to put himself through hell for the Academy to finally justifiably acknowledge his brilliance with a shiny hunk of metal. And that performative achievement is precisely why The Revenant is fundamentally a one-and-out experience. Bleached by cold sun, smothered in mud, blood and worse, and practically stinking off the screen, this torrid tale of frontiersman Hugh Glass's near-death, near-bear experience in 1823 is the very definition of an ordeal. You watch transfixed as DiCaprio drags his body through the most unimaginable horrors repeatedly over and over again until a happy ending involving a heavy wounding and the knowledge that the real Hugh Glass was killed by the same tribe that spared him in the movie 10 years later. If you want to watch that all over again, are you okay?
Women Talking. Sarah Polley's Women Talking was one of 2022's most acclaimed films, a restrained, impeccably acted adaptation of Miriam Toews' novel of the same name. And even accepting that, like The Whale, it received criticism for feeling like a filmed stage play, that isn't the big reason why you'll likely feel no inclination to ever go back to it. This drama about a group of American Mennonite women deciding whether to remain in their colony, following a series of horrific abuses by the community's men, makes one big aesthetic mistake which renders this otherwise absorbing film a bit of an eyesore to sit through. Upon release, Women Talking's washed-out color grading was widely criticized, giving almost the entire movie an extremely flat, drab look. While this was obviously an intentional artistic choice by the director and her colorist, it makes an already staid, severe film even less appealing to return to because it's so damn unpleasant to look at, sadly. What a shame.